The streets of the small town were blanketed in a thick layer of snow, muffling the sounds of the bustling Christmas Eve rush. Strings of twinkling lights glowed warmly in the windows of shops and homes, casting golden halos onto the frosty ground. Daniel, a 14-year-old boy with a mop of unruly brown hair, walked beside his mother, Sarah, through the town square. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and his scarf had slipped slightly, exposing his chin to the biting winter air. But Daniel didn't seem to notice. His hands were buried in his coat pockets, feeling the crinkle of the $20 bill he had been saving for weeks to buy a gift for his mom. As they passed the corner by the bakery, Daniel saw him. A man, likely in his 40s, sat on the sidewalk near the lamppost, hunched against the cold. His coat was frayed, his beard thick with streaks of gray, and his hands red and chapped. Beside him lay a small cardboard sign just $20 short of a warm place to stay tonight. Anything helps. Next to the sign sat a worn backpack, and in his lap, he cradled a tin can with a few coins jingling inside. Daniel stopped abruptly, pulling his mother's sleeve. "Mom, wait," he said, his voice a mix of urgency and resolve. Sarah looked at him, puzzled. "Daniel, what's the matter?" He pointed to the man. "He needs help." Sarah hesitated, glancing at the man. "Honey, we don't know his story. Sometimes people need more than just money to make things better." "But Mom," Daniel insisted, "he's only $20 short. That's all he needs for a motel tonight. I have $20. Before Sarah could respond, Daniel stepped toward the man, pulling the bill from his pocket. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice clear and steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. The man looked up, startled. His blue eyes, weary but kind, locked onto Daniel's. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "I want you to have this," Daniel said, holding out the crisp $20 bill. "So you can stay somewhere warm tonight." The man stared at the bill, his expression a mixture of surprise and gratitude. I don't know what to say," he murmured. "You don't have to do this, son." "I want to," Daniel said firmly. "It's Christmas Eve. Everyone deserves to be warm." Sarah watched the exchange, her heart swelling with pride and concern. She stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "What's your name?" she asked the man softly. "Nick," he replied, his voice cracking slightly. "Nick Harper." "And thank you. Both of you," he glanced at Daniel. "You've got a good heart, kid." Nick carefully tucked the bill into his coat pocket, his hands trembling. He let out a long breath, as though the weight of the world had just lifted slightly from his shoulders. "I didn't expect anyone to stop today. Most people don't." Daniel sat on his haunches, meeting Nick's gaze. "How did you end up out here?" he asked, his tone curious but gentle. Nick hesitated, glancing at Sarah for permission. She nodded encouragingly, and he began to speak. "It's a long story," he said, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "I used to have a decent life. A job, a house, even a family. But things fell apart about 2 years ago. I lost my job when the company I worked for downsized. Then the bills piled up. My wife and I, we didn't make it through that. I've been trying to get back on my feet ever since." Daniel frowned, his young face creased with concern. "That sounds really hard. But you're trying, right? That's what matters." Nick smiled faintly. "Yeah, I'm trying. Some days are better than others. Tonight would have been rough without you." As they talked, a man standing a few feet away pretended to examine the bakery's window display. He wasn't just looking at the festive pastries, though. He had overheard every word. The man, dressed in a tailored wool coat and polished shoes, seemed out of place on the snowy sidewalk. His face was lined with age, but his piercing green eyes and confident posture exuded vitality. When Daniel and Nick finished their conversation, the man stepped closer, clearing his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice warm but commanding. Daniel and Sarah turned toward him, and Nick's eyes widened slightly. "I couldn't help but overhear," the man continued. I hope you don't mind me saying, but what you just did, young man, was one of the kindest things I've seen in a long time." Daniel shuffled his feet, his cheeks flushing for a different reason now. "I just wanted to help," he mumbled. The man smiled. "And you did. More than you know." He turned to Nick. "Mr. Harper, is it? Would you and this wonderful young man and his mother join me for coffee at the cafe just down the street? Say in an hour? I'd like to hear more about your story." Nick hesitated, his instincts warning him to be cautious. But the man's demeanor was sincere, and he felt a strange glimmer of hope. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded. "We'll be there," she said, her voice steady but curious. The man extended his hand to Nick. "By the way, I'm Henry Marshall. It's a pleasure to meet you." Nick shook his hand, the warmth of the gesture spreading through him. As the group parted ways to meet later, Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. Something told him this Christmas Eve was about to be unforgettable. The cafe at the edge of the square was a cozy refuge from the icy winds outside. Its frosted windows glowed with a warm golden light, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon lingered in the air. Daniel, Sarah, and Nick stepped inside, their faces flushed from the cold. Nick, still wearing his tattered coat, stood out among the cheerful holiday patrons, but Daniel didn't seem to notice. He smiled at Nick and motioned toward a corner table where Henry Marshall sat waiting. Henry waved them over, his polished manners and warm smile making him seem approachable despite his air of sophistication. A steaming cup of coffee sat in front of him, along with an untouched plate of scones. "Welcome," Henry said as they reached the table. He stood and shook hands with each of them, even Daniel. "Please sit. Can I get anyone something to drink? Hot cocoa, perhaps?" Daniel's eyes lit up. "Hot cocoa would be great, thanks." Sarah politely declined, and Nick hesitated before nodding. "Coffee, if that's all right, black." Henry gestured to a passing waitress, quickly placing the orders. Once everyone was settled, he leaned forward, his green eyes full of genuine curiosity. "Nick, I'd love to hear more about you. What happened that brought you to this point? If you don't mind sharing, of course." Nick glanced at Sarah and Daniel. They both smiled encouragingly, and for the first time in a long while, Nick felt safe enough to open up. "Well," Nick began, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup when it arrived. "Like I said earlier, it all started when I lost my job. I worked in logistics for a trucking company for over 15 years. Good job, steady pay. But when the pandemic hit, they let a lot of us go. I didn't have much savings. And before I knew it, the bills piled up. Rent, utilities, car payments, everything fell apart at once." Henry nodded sympathetically. "That must have been incredibly difficult." It was, Nick admitted. "I tried to find work, but nothing stable came up. My wife. She couldn't handle the stress. We drifted apart, and eventually she left. After that, I couldn't keep up with the rent, and I ended up losing the apartment too. It's been a fight every day since then just to stay afloat." Daniel's face was a mix of sadness and admiration. "But you're still trying," he said. "That's what matters, right?" Nick smiled faintly, his eyes misting. "Yeah, I am. I've been picking up odd jobs when I can. Shoveling snow, cleaning up construction sites, even helping at a food pantry now and then. It's not much, but it's something." Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Nick, you remind me of someone I knew a long time ago." "Me?" Nick blinked, clearly surprised. "You?" Henry chuckled softly. "Oh yes, you see, before I built my company, I went through something similar. I wasn't homeless, but I was close. I lost my first business in my 20s, and spent months living on a friend's couch, wondering how I'd ever get back on my feet. It was only through the kindness of a stranger, an old mentor, who gave me a chance that I managed to turn things around." Daniel's eyes widened. "You had to start over too." Henry nodded. "Indeed, I did. And that's why I believe so strongly in second chances." He turned to Nick, his expression earnest. Nick, I'd like to extend an invitation. My wife and I are hosting a small Christmas dinner tomorrow. Just the two of us, usually, but I think we could use some company this year. Would you join us? Nick's jaw dropped slightly. I don't know what to say. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. You wouldn't be imposing at all, Henry insisted. We'd be honored to have you. And Daniel and Sarah, you're welcome to join us as well. It would be wonderful to have you there. Daniel's face lit up with excitement. That sounds amazing. What do you think, Mom? Sarah hesitated, her protective instincts kicking in. But as she looked at Henry's sincere expression and the glimmer of hope in Nick's eyes, she smiled. We'd be happy to join you. Thank you for inviting us. Nick swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. I don't think I've had a Christmas dinner in years. Henry smiled warmly. Then it settled. Tomorrow evening we'll celebrate together. And Nick, I'd like to talk more about how I can help you rebuild. If you're open to it, of course. Nick nodded, his heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For the first time in years, he felt like his life might actually take a turn for the better. As the group left the cafe, Henry handed Nick a card with his address and phone number. I'll see you all tomorrow, he said, his voice full of promise. Nick held the card tightly, feeling its weight as though it were a lifeline. He couldn't believe the kindness of these strangers, first Daniel, then Henry, and he vowed to make the most of this unexpected second chance. That night, Nick checked into the small motel on the edge of town, thanks to the $20 Daniel had given him. The room was simple: a bed, a small table with a lamp, and a modest bathroom, but to Nick, it felt like luxury. For the first time in months, he slept indoors, with a roof over his head and warmth shielding him from the bitter cold outside. As he lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, he thought about Daniel's kindness and the unexpected events of the day. I've been out here so long I forgot what it feels like to have hope, Nick murmured to himself before sleep overtook him. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the curtains woke him. For a moment, he forgot where he was. But as his surroundings came into focus, he smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a new beginning, however small. Nick decided he couldn't show up to Henry Marshall's house looking like the man who had been sitting on the sidewalk the day before. He wanted to appear dignified, as if he truly belonged at a Christmas dinner. Resolving to make the best impression possible, he used part of the money he'd saved to buy a fresh razor and a travel-sized shampoo from the dollar store nearby. Back in the motel room, he stood in front of the small mirror above the sink and carefully shaved, washing away the scruffy beard he'd grown over the past year. With his hair combed and his face clean-shaven, he hardly recognized himself. His coat and jeans were still worn, but they looked presentable enough once he brushed them off. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel was practically bouncing with excitement as he and Sarah prepared to leave for the dinner. Daniel had spent part of the morning wrapping a small gift for Nick, a pair of gloves he'd bought with his remaining allowance. Do you think he'll like them? Mom, Daniel asked as he tucked the package into a bag. I think he'll love them, Sarah replied with a smile. It's thoughtful and practical, and it shows how much you care. At 5 o'clock sharp, Daniel and Sarah arrived at the motel to pick up Nick. Nick hesitated as he climbed into the back seat of their car. Thanks again for giving me a ride. I wasn't sure how I was going to get there. Sarah smiled warmly at him in the rearview mirror. It's no trouble at all. We're happy to have you with us. Daniel turned in his seat, grinning. You look great, Nick. Nick chuckled nervously. Thanks, kid. It's been a while since anyone said that to me. The drive to Henry Marshall's house was short but filled with anticipation. When they arrived, Nick's breath caught in his throat. The house was everything he imagined and more: a sprawling two-story home adorned with glowing lights and a wreath on the front door. The faint scent of roasted turkey drifted into the cold evening air as they stepped out of the car. Henry greeted them warmly at the door, his polished manners and cheerful smile putting Nick slightly at ease. Welcome, he said, shaking Nick's hand firmly. It's wonderful to see you again. Come in. Inside, the house was as grand as the exterior suggested. A large Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, its branches heavy with ornaments and garlands. The fireplace crackled, casting a warm glow over the room. Henry's wife, Margaret, emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She was elegant yet approachable, her eyes sparkling with kindness. You must be Nick, she said, shaking his hand. It's a pleasure to have you here. I hope you're hungry. Nick managed a smile. I am. Thank you for having me. Dinner was a feast: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, and cranberry sauce, followed by an array of desserts. But more than the food, it was the atmosphere that made the evening special. Henry and Margaret made a point to include Nick in every conversation, asking about his life, his interests, and his hopes for the future. By the time dessert was served, Nick felt a sense of belonging he hadn't known in years. He even found himself laughing as Daniel recounted a story about slipping on the ice while trying to help a neighbor shovel snow. After dinner, as they sat around the fireplace, Henry turned to Nick with a serious expression. Nick, he said, I meant what I said yesterday. I'd like to help you get back on your feet. If you're open to it, I'd like to offer you a short-term job. One of my rental properties needs maintenance and repairs. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest, and it's a start. While you're working, you can stay in one of the units rent-free until you're on your feet. Nick's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together. You're serious? Completely, Henry said. I've been where you are, Nick. I know how hard it is. I want to give you the same chance someone once gave me. Tears welled in Nick's eyes as he struggled to find the right words. I don't know how to thank you. This means everything to me. Henry placed a hand on Nick's shoulder. Just do your best, that's all I ask. And when you're able, pay it forward to someone else. As the evening wound down, Margaret handed each guest a small gift bag filled with homemade cookies and chocolates. Daniel eagerly tore into his on the ride home, while Nick clutched his bag like a treasure. For the first time in years, Nick felt the warmth of hope and belonging. As he stepped out into the crisp night air, he silently vowed to make the most of this opportunity and honor the kindness that had been shown to him. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Sarah and Daniel's modest apartment. Despite the cold outside, the little home felt warm, thanks to the glow of their small, well-loved Christmas tree in the corner. Sarah was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes while Daniel sat at the table, carefully unwrapping the gift Nick had given him before they parted ways the night before, a simple but heartfelt handwritten note thanking him for his kindness and reminding him that small acts of goodness could change lives. Daniel smiled as he read it again, folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket like a treasure. Mom, he said, his voice full of thought, last night was amazing. I can't believe how much Henry and Margaret helped Nick. Do you think he'll be okay now? Sarah placed a stack of pancakes on the table, her expression warm. I think he has a good start, and sometimes that's all someone needs. And you, Daniel, you started it. That act of kindness, it made everything else possible. Before Daniel could respond, there was a knock at the door. Sarah glanced at the clock, her brow furrowing slightly. It was still early. I wonder who that could be, she said, walking over to open it. Standing in the hallway was Henry Marshall, dressed in a smart but casual sweater and slacks. His face lit up with a friendly smile when he saw Sarah and Daniel. Good morning, he said cheerfully. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Sarah, surprised but pleased, stepped back to let him in. Not at all, Mr. Marshall. Please come in. Thank you, Henry said, stepping inside and immediately noticing the cozy warmth of the apartment. He held up a large gift bag. I hope you don't mind a little visit. I realized there was more I wanted to say after last night. Daniel's eyes widened as he came over to greet Henry. Hi, Mr. Marshall. Is everything okay? More than okay, Henry replied, his tone warm. I wanted to stop by because I have a few more gifts to share. After all, it's still Christmas. Henry set the gift bag on the table and reached inside, pulling out an envelope. He handed it to Sarah, who hesitated before opening it. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper inside a check for $2,500. Sarah gasped, her eyes welling with tears. "Mr. Marshall, this is too much. I don't know how to thank you." Henry shook his head gently. "It's not too much at all. I've seen the strength and dedication it takes to raise a child, especially on your own. I wanted to do something to ease your burden, even if just a little. Consider this a gift to help with any bills or expenses you've been carrying." Sarah pressed a hand to her heart, struggling to find the right words. "You've already done so much. I can't thank you enough." Henry smiled warmly and then turned to Daniel. "And as for you, young man, I want to talk about your future. You mentioned last night that you dream of becoming an engineer. Well, I believe in supporting dreams, especially when they're tied to a heart as good as yours." He reached into the bag again and pulled out a neatly typed letter. "This," he said, handing it to Daniel, "is a commitment letter. When the time comes for you to go to college, I will cover your tuition and related expenses up to $10,000. It's an investment in someone I believe will make a difference in the world." Daniel stared at the letter, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process what he was holding. You'd do that for me," he finally whispered. "Absolutely," Henry said, his voice full of warmth. "Your kindness set everything in motion. It reminded me of the power we have to help others. I know you'll do great things, Daniel, and I want to make sure nothing stands in your way." Daniel threw his arms around Henry in a spontaneous hug, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you. I won't let you down. I promise." Henry patted Daniel's back, his own eyes misting slightly. "I know you won't, son. Just keep being yourself, that's more than enough." The morning ended with laughter, gratitude, and the sharing of pancakes at the little table. Henry stayed for a while, talking with Sarah and Daniel about their lives and dreams, making it clear that this was only the beginning of a friendship. As he left later that morning, Henry paused at the door, turning back with a smile. "Merry Christmas, Sarah. Merry Christmas, Daniel. I'm looking forward to seeing all the amazing things you'll do." As the door closed behind him, Sarah and Daniel looked at each other, their hearts full of gratitude and wonder. This Christmas had brought more than just gifts, it had brought hope, second chances, and the reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple out to create something extraordinary. The days following Christmas were filled with a new sense of purpose and possibility for everyone touched by the events of the holiday. Nick, now settled into the small rental property Henry had offered, began his maintenance job with enthusiasm. Though the work was physically demanding, he approached each task with gratitude, knowing this was his chance to rebuild. On his first payday, Nick stopped by the same corner where he had been sitting just days before. He held a paper bag in one hand, filled with sandwiches and water bottles. Sitting on the curb was another man who looked as weary and cold as Nick had once felt. "Hey," Nick said, crouching down beside him. "I've been where you are. This is for you." The man looked up, startled, then took the bag with a hesitant smile. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Nick nodded. "Hang in there. Things can change." Meanwhile, Daniel and Sarah were settling back into their routine. Though life now felt brighter, Sarah used part of Henry's gift to pay off several overdue bills, finally allowing herself a full night's rest without the weight of financial worry pressing down on her. With what remained, she bought a new winter coat for herself and a sturdy pair of boots for Daniel. Daniel, for his part, had been working on a thank you gift for Henry. With his love for gadgets and tinkering, he built a small, intricate wooden clock, hand-painting the details and engraving "Thank you for believing in me" along the base. When he presented it to Henry during a visit to the Marshall home a week later, Henry's face lit up. "This is incredible, Daniel," he said, running his fingers over the smooth woodwork. "You've got a real talent. This will sit right here on my desk to remind me why I do what I do." As winter gave way to spring, the ripple effects of Daniel's act of kindness continued to grow. Inspired by the story of what had happened on Christmas Eve, Sarah's co-workers organized a fundraiser to help other families in need during the holidays. The local shelter, where Nick sometimes volunteered, received a boost in donations after he shared his journey with the staff. Henry stayed connected with Nick, guiding him not just in his work but in rebuilding his confidence and sense of direction. They often sat together after long days, talking about life, struggles, and second chances over cups of coffee. One evening, Nick shared an idea with Henry. "I want to start a program to help others like me," he said. "A way to connect people who've hit rock bottom with those willing to give them a chance. Like you gave me." Henry's eyes lit up. "I think that's a fantastic idea, Nick. And I'd be honored to help you get it off the ground." By the following Christmas, Nick's program, aptly named Second Step, was up and running. It connected individuals experiencing homelessness with mentors, short-term housing, and employment opportunities. At its heart was the belief that small acts of kindness, like Daniel's $20 gift, could spark life-changing transformations. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Daniel first approached Nick on that snowy sidewalk, the two families gathered again at the Marshall home. The dinner table was filled with laughter and warmth as they shared stories of the past year. Nick, now visibly healthier and more confident, raised his glass to propose a toast. "To kindness," he said, his voice steady and full of emotion. "To the moments when we choose to see each other, help each other, and believe in each other. I'm here today because of that, and I promise to carry it forward every chance I get." As glasses clinked and smiles filled the room, Daniel looked up at his mom, his heart full. The small act of kindness he had offered a year ago had grown into something extraordinary, touching not just Nick's life but his own, his mother's, and countless others. Henry leaned over to Daniel, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did something incredible that day, Daniel. Never forget that. And never stop believing in the power of kindness." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining. "I won't, Mr. Marshall. I promise." Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the town in quiet beauty. Inside, the warmth of hope, connection, and second chances glowed as brightly as the lights on the Christmas tree. It was a night none of them would ever forget, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures can create the biggest ripples,